Can you hear me now?
T-Mobile commercial?
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yep. I'm gonna have to start charging my phone before this.
All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. I was waiting a few minutes to see if anybody was getting on late. We were dealing with some technical difficulties with the YouTube live. Promise we're gonna get there. So this week is week 3. It's an 8-week class on the evidence for Christianity. Week 1 was kind of an introduction, just going through what apologetics is, why it's important, why we want to practice good apologetics, and then week 2 was the evidence for God. So before we can get into the evidence for Christianity, we have to establish the evidence for a God. And not, notice I said a God, not the God, or what we would consider the Christian God. Just at that point, it's a God. That's what last week was on. We went through 3 arguments for the existence of a God. And the first one was the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument states that anything that has a beginning must have a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. That's the cosmological Kalam argument in a nutshell. The second argument for the existence of God is the teleological argument. The teleological argument is an argument from design and divine tuning. So the cosmological argument is just saying, essentially you could think of it as like, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there anything rather than nothing? The teleological argument focuses more on the design, the purpose, the reason for our existence. If we look around, we can tell that the universe is finely tuned. We went through several metrics. We went through the law of gravity. We went through DNA. If you look around, if you take more than just a few seconds, you'll realize that we are.
Your mic's not working.
Are you serious?
Uh-huh.
Testing, testing. Hello. Testing. Check. And is the video on?
Mm-mm. It was working. But it's at a distance. Where's the other mic? It was working.
Check.
Go ahead.
Testing.
It's like lattice behind.
I bet we had them mixed up.
Testing.
See, it's picking up me.
Where are you going? You are just wiggling.
Now talk.
You got that foot? You got a foot?
Check 1, 2.
Test. That one's not working.
I'm trying to get those dogs.
You want to try this? You want this one? Now it is.
And then the back one too.
You want to try this? You want this one? Now it is. It's still picking me up. I don't think it's in there.
What changed? What has changed from last week?
Mm-hmm. Your phone's picking me up. I think that we're only on your phone. Your phone's picking me up. See? The charger. It's the only thing that changed from last week to this week.
Do we know for sure that that's turned on?
The charger.
Testing.
There you go.
All right, can you guys hear me now?
Yep.
Sorry about that. We were having some technical difficulties. Again, we're going to get it straight, I promise. Okay, I'm going to go back through I'm going to repeat everything I just said for those of you that are watching online. I apologize that we're
You
getting...
could hear, you just couldn't hear you well, so I don't think you have to. I mean, whatever you want to do.
Yeah, I'm going to go back through it a little bit. Okay, so we are in week 3 of the 8-week course called The Evidence for Christianity. weeks 1 and 2, we're just going to do a brief overview. We're not going to go through them in a lot of detail. We do have those recorded. If you guys want to view those videos, we can get you the link to the page where they're posted. But essentially, week 1, we were going over the introduction to apologetics, what apologetics is, why do we care about apologetics within Christianity, why you should practice apologetics, and why we should practice good apologetics, not just apologetics. And then we went through truth as well. So what truth is, why do we care about defining truth? Why do we care about being able to articulate truth to others? And then week 2, last week, we went through the evidence for God. And before you can start on the evidence for Christianity, you need to establish a firm foundation on the existence of a God. All right, it's the classical apologetics method, and it just makes the most sense in my mind to establish that here's the evidence for the existence of a God, and then once we establish that beyond a reasonable doubt, then we move to, okay, what God is it? What is this God saying? Is this a personal God? Is this the Christian God? And that's kind of where we're picking up today. We went through the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the moral arguments last week. The cosmological argument is an argument for God's existence that basically says everything that begins to exist everything that exists has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. I'll say that again because I think I butchered it. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. That's the cosmological argument. And we're saying that cause is an intelligent, timeless, immaterial being, which we would call God. The teleological argument is the design argument. This is the fine-tuning argument. So if you were to look at DNA, if you were to look at the law of gravity, the laws of nature, essentially, if you were to look at these laws of nature and change these laws, we wouldn't be here. So it appears that our universe has been finally, and it hasn't only been created, but it's been finely tuned for life. It's like that was the purpose of its design. And so that's the teleological argument, which gets into the design. And then the last one was the moral argument. The reason the moral argument is important is because the moral argument is saying that if objective moral values and duties exist, which we would all agree they do, even atheists would agree that objective morals and values exist. We know right from wrong. If that is true, there has to be something outside of us that has granted that objective moral standard for us. And we would say that is God. So that was the kind of a recap of last week. Like I said, you can go back and watch the videos. They are on the YouTube page if you want to see last week or the week before. I encourage you guys, if you didn't watch, I do encourage you to go back and watch those just so you're kind of caught up on where we're at.
Hey, we'll have to send a link for that. They're not public.
You can request a link for that, and we'll make sure you guys get a link to see it. Okay, if a God exists, what is it or he saying? If a God exists, what is it or he saying, right? So we established that a God exists. Now, what is this God saying? Who is this God? Well, we think it's the Christian God, and we're going to dive into that tonight. The Bible is a historical collection of documents that record the actions and words of God, if true. So, this week, we are not looking at what the Bible is saying per se. We are simply going to establish, is the Bible a historically reliable document, or is it a historically reliable set of documents? So in week 3, we're not asking you to believe the New Testament is the Word of God. That's not what we're doing here in week 3. Okay, we are going to get there, but we have to get there by first establishing, is the New Testament a reliable historical record of what happened, right? Are these documents really telling the truth? Because if it is, then by default, we must take seriously what it says about Jesus. So we can't just jump to, well, what does the Bible say about Jesus? Well, we have to first say, okay, is it even reliable? Right? Is this something that was made up in the past 2,000 years? Because if it was, then it doesn't really matter what it says about Jesus because it's made up, it's fabricated, right? So we have to prove that it is a historical record in the first place. It's the same way that a jury is going to look at a witness, right? Before a jury decides what a witness means, they first decide if the witness is credible at all, right? They're not going to bring a witness in and put them on the stand if they don't think they're even a credible witness, right? They have to first establish, okay, is this witness credible? Was this witness really there when the event took place? Okay, they were. All right, let's bring the witness in and, bring the witness in, and then we can, ask them questions and figure out what it is exactly that they saw. So the question is, are the New Testament documents reliable sources of information? All right, does anybody have any questions so far? You tracking the chat?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We do have Katie monitoring the chat, so if anybody watching has any questions, feel free to ask. And hey, this is supposed to be a relaxed environment, so you guys that are here in person, if you have questions, ask. So, judge-free zone. I mean, I'm going to judge you, but you're free to be judged. All right, what does reliable mean? So we're saying we have to establish that these documents are historically reliable. Well, what do we mean by reliable? We mean that there's enough evidence to conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that it's true. They're written close to the events. So pay attention to this right here. We're looking at these documents. When I say the New Testament documents, we're going to be focusing on the Gospels, okay? Because the Gospels are talking about the life of Jesus. And remember, Christianity hinges on Jesus. It hinges on the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So that's why we're going to focus on the Gospels. Because, hey, if we prove the Gospels are true, that proves that Jesus really, what they're claiming about Jesus really is true, right? Because the documents are true. What they're saying is true. And so naturally, that makes Christianity true. Now, we could debate about the other books in the Bible. However, if Jesus really is the Son of God and Christianity really is true, then that at least makes the other books possible to be true. Does that make sense? So that's why we're gonna take this, we're gonna eat this elephant one bite at a time and focus on the Gospels tonight. So, what does reliable mean? It means that there's enough evidence to conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that it's true. It means that it's written close to the events, right? So you have to think about it. These are eyewitnesses. The witnesses that are writing this down or telling these testimonies, were they actually there? And then how much time between when they were there, when it took place, the event took place, and when they wrote this down? Okay? And then, is it reliable? Is it based on eyewitnesses? But that adds validity to these documents. It's not just hearsay. It's not like I was there and I told Courtney what happened, and then Courtney told Emmy what happened, and then Emmy tells Katie what happened, and then Katie writes it down. You see what I'm saying? That's where when people say, oh, well, the New Testament, has been changed over time. It's like a game of telephone, right? You guys have probably heard that before. Oh, it's changed, but you got to think about it like a game of telephone. It's like me telling Courtney something, Courtney telling Emmy something. No, the Gospels were not created like that way, and we're going to look at that tonight. Were they accurately transmitted? All right. And then, are they legend developed over a period of time, or when they were first written, does that stand true today? All right. Have they stood the test of time? So let's look at the Gospels or legends written centuries later. I know you guys have heard this, right? Well, the New Testament Gospels, they were just written way after the death of Jesus. So how do they know, how do these people that wrote this down even know what actually took place? They weren't really there. Well, actually, the Gospels themselves are dated between 60 and 100 AD. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, that's what we're talking about tonight. Within the lifetime of eyewitnesses, in fact, 1 Corinthians was written between 53 and 55 AD. That's dated within a few years of Jesus' death. So we're not talking about manuscripts that were written years and years and years, hundreds of years after the event took place. We're talking about people that were actually there when the event occurred. Ruh-roh. I need my IT person up here. All right, I apologize if something is going on with the screen right now. We're going to look at Mark first. Bear with us, guys. We're dealing with more technical difficulties.
Where's this place?
It just shows we're authentic, right? We're not putting on a show. There it is.
Are you girl wearing a Christmas sweatshirt?
Yeah. Okay.
It's April.
Thank you guys for fixing it. So, okay. We're looking at the Gospels. And you might be thinking, well, aren't we trying to prove Christianity is true? Why are we just looking at the Gospels, right? You have the whole entire Bible. Why are we just looking at the Gospels? Remember, like I said, I'm going to remind you throughout tonight, we look at the Gospels because the Gospels claim that Jesus is the Messiah, right? Now, there's Old Testament documents that do as well, but we're focusing on the Gospels because if we validate the Gospels, then we can prove that what the Gospels are claiming is true, therefore Christianity is true, right? Or at least that's one piece of evidence that Christianity is true. So we're looking at the Gospels. We need to take into consideration the authors of the Gospels, okay? So we look at Mark, the book of Mark. The book of Mark is the earliest written gospel that we have. Meaning, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, okay? That's the four Gospels. The author, Mark, he wrote down his gospel the earliest, okay? So we have the birth of Jesus at 1 AD, and then there's the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus at 33 AD. He ascends to heaven, leaves us with the Holy Spirit. You guys are familiar with that. Matthew chapter 28. Then, so don't hold me to these dates. And what I mean by that is this could be, the date it was written could be 54 AD. It could be 56 AD. It's around that time. You could say between 50 and 60 AD would be a very realistic time frame. Historians would agree that Mark wrote his gospel between 50 and 60 AD. So I just split the difference and said 55 AD. All right? Mark lived between 10 and 65 AD. He was born around 10 AD and he died around 65 AD. Mark was a companion of Peter and Paul. Now, his occupation was unknown, meaning we don't know exactly what his job was, if he had a job. We do know that he was raised in a home where his mother was hosting Christian gatherings. So post resurrection, Jesus has ascended back to heaven. Now you have the birth of the early church. Okay, you have Christians that are coming out of hiding, and you got to think Jesus' ministry. All right, the time when Jesus was arrested, the disciples go into hiding. All right, they're scared, and we're going to get into this more later. But they're scared, they're in hiding. Jesus rises from the dead, and they're like, oh. Now they have a little more faith, right? Now they have a little more, they're not as fearful, and so they start following Jesus. And so they're coming out of hiding, and now Christians are starting to meet and gather. So we do know that Mark's home, sometime throughout his childhood into his teenage years, his mother was hosting Christian gatherings, what we would consider like a D group, right? They're getting together, they're worshiping Jesus, singing praise. So he grew up around that. That also indicates if they had a home big enough for these type of gatherings, they probably had a little bit of money, right? They weren't poor, okay? This is just an observation. It's not concrete. That's not concrete evidence, but it is a logical observation. So we don't know his occupation, but we do know that he was a companion of Peter and Paul. In fact, when Peter comes out of prison, he kind of takes Mark under his wing, okay? In fact, the book of Mark, you have to think about this. Mark was not even there. He was not an eyewitness of the life of Jesus, okay? Mark was not an eyewitness of the life during the life of Jesus. He wasn't on the scene. However, Peter was. And Peter is working close with Mark, and Mark is documenting this eyewitness account from Peter. All right? You guys tracking on that? So, the earliest manuscript that we currently have is Papyrus 137, also known as P137, and it's dated from 150 to 250 AD. This can be kind of confusing in the sense that you're thinking, you may be thinking, okay, well, the earliest manuscript is 150 to 250 AD. How does that put us back to 55 AD? Well, and how do we know that the original manuscript is accurate? Well, think about it like this. Actually, I'll explain that in a little more detail in a minute. I want to get through all the Gospels, and then we'll hit that part of it. Does anybody have any questions on Mark? Does it make sense what I'm saying here about the date of Mark writing his original manuscript versus on the timeline of when Jesus was on the scene? Okay. This is important. This date, this distance right here, this time right here between when the event actually took place and when it was first documented, that's important. All right, Luke. Luke is the next gospel in this order of timeline. So Luke was a friend of Paul. All right, Luke was also a doctor. He lived from about 15 AD to 80 AD. Again, this is rough, okay? It could be from 10 to 20 AD to 70 to 90 AD. Okay, it's in that. This is what historians have concluded based off of things that are in the book of Luke, right? Like if, for example, if Luke said nothing about the fall of Jerusalem, then most likely he wasn't around in 70 AD when the fall took place, right? When the second temple fell. Things like that, not that alone, but when you start piecing things like that together, you can conclude, okay, it's most likely that he wasn't there for this event. So we've got Luke dated to 15 to 80 AD. That's his lifespan. Luke was a friend of Paul. He was a doctor. He wrote his manuscript around 60 AD. All right. The earliest copy of the original manuscript that we have today is Papyrus 75 or P5. That should be P75 or Papyrus P4. And Papyrus 4. 175 to 225 AD is when these copies of the manuscripts that we have today are dated. Okay? Everybody following so far? Cool. So Luke was very educated. He was a doctor. Like I said, he was a friend of Paul. He was very methodical in his writings. So he was sure to document things, how they occurred. He did not want to leave out details that he thought was important. He was very careful in writing his gospel. Next we have Matthew. So Matthew comes in at around 80 AD. All right, Matthew lived between 5 AD and 85 AD. So he was born around 5 AD and he died around 85 AD. He was one of the 12 disciples. Matthew walked with Jesus. He witnessed Jesus, okay? He was a tax collector. The earliest manuscript we have of Matthew was Magdalen Papyrus P64, which is dated around 150 to 250 AD. That's the earliest manuscript that we have today. Then we move to John. Now this is John the Apostle. All right, John the Apostle lived between 10 and 95 AD. He was one of the 12 disciples as well. He was a fisherman. His manuscript was written, he wrote his manuscript around 90 AD. All right, this was the latest documented manuscript of the Gospels that we have. It was Papyrus P52, and the copy that we currently have, the oldest copy that we have today, is 125 to 150 AD. That was when it was written. All right, but if you notice, all of these are written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses themselves, right? The original manuscripts are dated to the lifetime of the original witnesses. What I mean by that is Luke wasn't writing his manuscript in 200 AD where he heard it from a friend of a friend of a friend what actually happened. No. We can date these manuscripts back to a time where excuse me. We can date them back to a time where these individuals were alive during the life of Jesus, which means they have firsthand eyewitness experience and knowledge of Jesus, right? With the exception of Mark. Mark was not the eyewitness. Peter was, but he's writing down, he's carefully writing down what Peter is saying. You're a saint. So that's very important because we're going to look at we're going to compare these Gospels to other historical documents, secular documents, and you're going to see that those documents were written hundreds of years after the event took place. Okay? So if someone is willing to accept those documents as historical fact, then you would have to have more faith to accept that than accept the Gospels as historical facts. Any questions? You awful quiet tonight, Amy. You just taking it in?
I think this is a lot. Like when I was looking at these slides for you, I had to go back through them. Had to go back through them a couple different times. So
Is it a lot? You guys think it's a lot?
I think it's just because it's numbers and like just trying to take in all the numbers.
Does the timeline help any as far as picturing where these events took place in reference to the life of Jesus? All right. Okay, so you can see right here, let me go back. Around 70 AD is when the temple was destroyed. By the way, Jesus foretold that the second temple was going to be destroyed. And you notice that some of Paul's writings date back to within a few years of Jesus' death. Like 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, that was around 50 AD. Like we said, there's no mention of the fall of Jerusalem in those writings. That was a very prominent, or that was an impact event that Paul would have definitely wrote about, because Jesus, like I said, Jesus called it. He said that was going to happen. But you don't see Paul writing about that in 1 Corinthians 15 because it hadn't happened yet. Right? Here's when the second temple was destroyed, and he's writing that in 50 AD. And then you look at the deaths of Peter, Paul, and James. So that suggests early composition as well. They died around 66. Like I said, it could be 65, could be 67, but somewhere in that time frame, we know beyond a reasonable doubt that's when Peter, Paul, and James died, were martyred. So what? Okay, let me go back though. Let me go back real quick before we get into the myth part. So, I want to talk about this right here. All right, we're saying that the Gospels were written 55, 60, 80, and 90 AD. And you could say, well, the earliest manuscript we have is 125 to 150 AD. So how is that reliable? And why do we not have the originals if that's the case? Well, you have to think about it. When these originals were written down, okay, the earliest one we have is 125. So you're talking, 35 years into the future is the earliest one that we have, okay? So that's at least 35 years, and that's for the latest one, that the original was in circulation. Now, if Jesus really was who they're claiming, and he proved it on the cross, you can imagine how the church is starting to take off, and everyone is wanting to get their hands on these manuscripts. Everyone is wanting to get their hands on these testimonies. So what are they doing? They're making copies. They're making copies. They're making copies. They're passing these manuscripts, making copies. And what happens? People are touching them. This was written on papyrus, which was a plant-based paper. So humidity has an effect on it as well. It makes sense why the original manuscripts aren't still around today. When they were passed around to make copies and copies and copies and copies, which is also further evidence that there wasn't change in what was being said, that's why we don't have the originals. We probably don't have the original and then a copy of the original, and then maybe this was the copy of that first copy, right? But that doesn't mean that it doesn't say the same thing. And here's why. If I witness an event and I write it down, and then let's say Emmy is like, man, I want to have a copy of what Josh wrote down, what Josh witnessed. So you come and you look at the manuscript that I wrote, the original, and you copy it word for word. Well, is your copy any less accurate than mine? It's just as accurate. The fact that it is not the original doesn't make it any less accurate, right? It just means that it's not the one that I wrote down. But it could be exactly the same, right? It could say exactly the same thing as the one that I wrote down. In fact, it would almost have to, because you made a copy of it, you made a copy of it, you made a copy of it, everyone watching made a copy of it. And so if you changed yours from my original, they can all take their copies and compare it to yours and to mine and identify very quickly which one is different, right? So that's how, that's part of the reason we know that there wasn't a bunch of change going on with these copies, because it would have been picked up immediately. And I think that's why we don't have the originals, because they were being passed around, making copies and copies and copies of. Okay? Does anybody have any questions about that? What the difference is in the date that the original copy was written down and then the one that we have, the earliest one we have that survived. There was persecution too. You need to consider that. If the originals were being stored somewhere in Jerusalem, that they made copies, people were starting to spread out because they were being persecuted. The original may have gotten destroyed, so now you just have hundreds of copies.
I was going to wait for you to finish your
Okay.
thought.
So now you have hundreds of copies out there of that original. It's just the original is destroyed. But the original is no more or less valid than all these copies, because you could very easily point out a change or discrepancy in them.
However, you just made the comment, they're making these copies and then spreading out. Well, it's not like they have Facebook right now where I can post, hey, can we get some subscribers on YouTube so we can do this quickly? So how are they going to know that the copies are different?
Well, we have a copy from 125 AD, right? And then we have our copy that we have today, right? And then you have, well, we'll get to this later on too, but you have like 20,000 manuscripts, and they all say the same thing. So if there was a discrepancy, if there was somebody that took this copy that was different out, and then they started making copies, you're going to notice, and actually, that was done, and those discrepancies were pointed out, and that's where you get like the Apocrypha, the books of the Bible that people say were taken out. They weren't taken out; they were just never part of the canon. People tried to add them in, and the early church fathers, the early church theologians, pointed out, hey, these are not in the original documents, so they're not. They were added later. And so even you might be able to take your copy and change it, and that may work for 100 years, wherever you're at. But eventually, it's going to be compared to all of the other documents or other copies and pointed out that it is different. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Mhm.
Okay. Was that your question or somebody else?
No, that was my question.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions? That was a good question.
No, I just feel like on that, I feel like you're gonna have more than one person making a copy of it. Like if you're in school and you and a friend are copying notes, like you're gonna have the note, the original in the middle, and you're both gonna be copying maybe. I mean, they may not have, but.
Well, you got to think about it like this too. During the early church, you know, these manuscripts were written down on papyri that could have been 20 feet long. These scrolls could have been 20 feet long. And not everybody knew how to write. So I don't know, maybe, you know, further along in time, there were more people making copies, definitely. But during that first, 100 years, there weren't that many people that were, there weren't that many different people making copies. Now, if you knew how to write and read and write, then you may make 100 copies or 50 copies for other people, right? You're the one making the copy, and they are just going to own that copy, distribute it out. So you would be distributing out those copies. And it was expensive. It was expensive to get the paper to do it. That's why, you know, people say that during the first century, they were very ignorant. They weren't ignorant. They just didn't have the ability to have the access to paper to read and write. So it was a very oral culture, which doesn't make them ignorant. In fact, I think they were a lot more intelligent in a lot of ways because they could memorize. The disciples were actually trained by rabbis to memorize Scripture. Like, that was part of their training. Good question, though. All right, so what? Not enough time for myth or legend to develop. You notice that date there that we're talking about, there's not enough time here between the actual event and when this was written down for myths and legends to start building and growing. No, these are people that were eyewitnesses that are writing this down. Now, are the Gospels based on eyewitness testimonies? So the objection could be, well, yeah, that's all fine and dandy. However, what if these people are just making this up? Yeah, maybe they wrote that transcript, that document in 55 AD. But why does that make it accurate? What makes them a reliable witness? Couldn't they just lie about what they were writing down? Couldn't they have just made up the story of the Jesus account, right? Well, if we look at the evidence, the cultural insight, and then some takeaways, Luke 1:1-4, explicit historical method. John 21:24, this is the disciple who testifies. They named individual. The individuals that they named can be verified in history through other extra biblical documents. So it indicates that they were in fact eyewitnesses of events that were taking place during that time, right? It further validates that these weren't written down later, hundreds of years later. They were written down during this time frame because the language they used, the type of names that they're using, and then, which we're going to get to this a little more in depth, but they include embarrassing details about themselves. Who is going to make something up and write embarrassing details about themselves? Then we have cultural insight. So oral cultures preserve teaching carefully. That's what we're talking about. They were a very oral culture. They weren't writing everything down. If they had the access to paper that we have today, they probably would have learned very quickly how to read and write and wrote it down the way that we do. But they didn't. So they were oral culture. They were trained on how to memorize Scripture, how to memorize these events. And the takeaways, they're not anonymous legends. They're tied to real people who witnessed the events. Okay? What if the text has been corrupted over time? So we can say, all right, what if what they originally wrote down was accurate? But how do you know that that hasn't been changed over time? The Bible has been changed over a period of time. That's the objection, right? Well, here we have manuscript evidence. So we've got 5,800 Greek New Testament manuscripts over a 1,300-year span. And so that speaks to what we were just saying, where, yeah, you could have got away with changing your copy for a certain amount of time, but when you have over 5,800 Greek New Testament manuscripts over a 1,300-year period, you're going to be able to identify the one that was changed. Or, if there was 100 copies that were changed, you're going to be able to identify, okay, these are different. There's 20,000 plus total if we're talking about all languages, right? Remember when God sent them out and changed all the languages after the tower? The earliest we have are within 100 years. So what about the variants? Yeah, variants exist, okay? Don't be afraid if somebody says, well, there's a variants within the Gospels. So if you don't know, the Gospel accounts are eyewitness testimonies of events that took place during the life of Jesus. A lot of it revolves around the death, burial, and resurrection, but it was ultimately during the life of Jesus. Now, why should we not be afraid of variants in those eyewitness testimonies? Anybody?
Well, I mean, they wouldn't all see it the same way. Like, they could have walked up at a different point or left, like, they, different angles, you see and hear different things.
So Courtney's comment is that you see different angles, you see different things, you could see it different ways.
Yeah. In fact, J. Warner Wallace was a cold case detective, and he's a Christian apologist, and he says that when he was doing detective work, he would get called out. There would be a crime scene, and the cops, there would be like local PD would be the first on the scenes. And then they would call him because he was the detective on call. And the first thing he would tell those cops is, hey, keep the witnesses separated. Keep them separated. So if you got to put them in different cop cars, whatever, don't let them, corroborate their stories. Because what ends up happening is, if you got two people who are committing a crime, right, they're going to corroborate and say, okay, hey, look, listen, we're going to tell him, that we were here at this time. We weren't on scene, whatever, right? But their stories are going to match. And that doesn't, having multiple eyewitnesses with matching stories doesn't make it valid. It actually shows that it's been fabricated. What you want is an authentic, like Courtney was saying, you want an authentic version of that eyewitness. So the perspective matters. What they saw is going to be different. The angle is going to be different. Their emotions are going to be different. That shows authenticity in those documents. And furthermore, most of the variants are just spelling in word order. They're still saying the same thing. If somebody walked in here right now and they come in here with a gun shooting up the place, and let's say, we eliminated the threat, and then the cops show up and they interview us all or interrogate us all, whatever it's called. I may say he came in with this hood on, and he pulled out a pistol and started shooting at the ceiling. Courtney may say he didn't have his hood on. It looked like he had a shotgun, and he was just shooting everywhere, right? And Emmy may say a different story. And it's not that, oh, well, Courtney wasn't there, or Josh wasn't there, or Emmy wasn't there. No, it's just different perspectives. J. Warner Wallace gives an example of this robber that came into a convenience store and robbed the convenience store. And later they interviewed the customers that were in the convenience store and the clerk that was working there. And they all had different stories of what this person was wearing. One of them said they had a jacket on. One of them said they had a T-shirt on. One of them said that they had a Glock. The other one said it was a Beretta, whatever. And the point is, that doesn't make their stories not authentic. That doesn't mean that it's not true what they're saying. You can still gather from their stories that there was a guy in the convenience store, that he was robbing the convenience store, that he had a gun, right? That he shot his gun. Like, those are the important details. And the same thing with the variants, the spelling and word order of the variations of the Gospels. Okay, even if spelling error and error is there, you still can gather from the Gospels that Jesus was the Messiah, right? He died on a cross. He was buried. He rose 3 days later, right? There's still core, what is important to us, that information is still there and can still be extrapolated from it. So I don't care about spelling errors. I don't care about word order. That doesn't change the authenticity of the event itself. Just like, the eyewitness testimonies and the differences in the eyewitness testimonies, they're minor differences at best. But you have skeptics that they'll try to nitpick any little thing, right? Even if they were identical, they would say that they were copied, right? So you're not going to win with some people because they're going to look for anything to try to invalidate these manuscripts. All right, we're going to compare the New Testament Gospels, New Testament manuscripts to other ancient work. The reason this is important, sorry if you guys don't watching online hear me sniffling and everything. I'm getting over some type of cold. The reason we want to look at other ancient works compared to New Testament writings is because if you can accept the writings of Caesar, if you can accept the writings of Tacitus, of Plato, then why wouldn't you accept the authenticity of the New Testament Gospels? If you look here, the New Testament Gospels were written between 50 and 95 AD, right? We already went over that. Well, Caesar was written about in 1,000 or 1,000 years after the event took place. 1,000 years, right? That's what we care about. When did the event take place, and then when was the first testimony made, right? That distance there is what we care about, not the time from when the testimony was written down to now, right? It could be 2,000 years and still be accurate. Question?
Why do we care about that?
Because if there's a 1,000-year gap between when the event actually took place and when that was documented, that's a long time for there to be change. That's a long time for there to be discrepancy. How do you verify that those events actually took place? Because you're not hearing it from eyewitnesses, right? You're not hearing about that event from eyewitnesses. You're hearing about it 1,000 years later. So if you have an event that took place and people that were witnesses of the event that wrote it down, that gives way to more validity of the testimony or claim itself, because there wasn't a big gap in that time frame. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Does that make sense?
I'm sorry if you're gonna go over this anyway, but are you gonna tell us like about what each of those people said in relation?
No, because we've got a lot more to cover.
But like, are you saying that those like Caesar, Tacitus, and Plato all talked about Jesus?
No. We are going to get to that.
Okay.
We are going to get to extra biblical documents that talk about Jesus.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
okay.
This is
You're just saying like if we're believing these documents, then why wouldn't we believe those?
exactly. So essentially what it's doing is comparing and contrasting other historical documents that we accept as historical documents.
And what you're saying is that the Caesar document was written 1,000 years after Caesar lived. Okay, or after the event. Okay. I was very confused. I'm glad I asked questions. Okay.
No,
sorry.
thank you for asking that. I probably didn't do a good job of explaining it. Plato was written about 1,300 years after Plato lived, right? So there's a long time there before there was any documentation of that. That's a long time for there to be change, for there to be, things dropped off. And that's why it's important to compare and contrast this to the New Testament documents. The earliest New Testament documents were written shortly after the event by people that actually were eyewitnesses of the event that took place. They weren't a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend. Archaeology, external confirmation. So this is that external confirmation that you were asking about. Extra biblical writings that speak to Jesus. Now, keep in mind, this week we're not trying to make a case for Jesus as being the Messiah. That's not what we're doing this week. What we're doing is we're establishing that the Gospels are historically reliable documents, that they haven't been changed, that the eyewitnesses are telling the truth. We have evidence of these eyewitnesses actually living during that time period. And then once we establish that, moving forward in the coming weeks, then we will start saying, oh, we're going to look at, okay, what, now that we've proven that these eyewitness testimonies are true, what are they saying? Okay, and that's where we get into, okay, well, they're claiming that they're saying Jesus was the Messiah. Well, if we know this is a historical fact, this document is historically accurate, then it kind of leads to the fact that what they're saying about Jesus was true. But we're going to get there. Right now, we're just looking at these as historically accurate documents, right? They could be saying whatever. I don't know what they're saying. We don't know what they're saying yet, right? We're just looking at them and saying, okay, whatever they said is reliable. So, some external documents that we have that further provide evidence for the validity of Jesus, of the Gospels, Pontius Pilate's inscription. So, let's see. I was thinking about. Okay, there's the bone box. All right, so Pontius Pilate inscription, it was found in Sisera, which is in Israel in 1961. This inscription says Pontius Pilate, perfect of Judea. It confirms the historical accuracy stated in the Gospels. The Gospels state that Pontius Pilate was the one that turned Jesus over to the Jews, right? He was the one that made the decision. And so we have external confirmation that he was in fact alive during that time period. Now, that's not to say that, oh, well, because we have this external document that it makes it true, but it does add evidence to the fact, right? We're taking all these pieces of evidence and we're combining them and saying, okay, we can conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that this occurred, and we're backing it up with these people, these external confirmations. The pool of Bethesda in John chapter 5. So it talks about a pool with 5 covered porticos. Well, in the late 1800s, archaeologists uncovered a pool near the Sheep's Gate, as John says. Okay, it's within a dividing wall in between, or it has a dividing wall in between, and that structure created 5 porticos or covered walkways. So here we have archaeological evidence pointing back to what John was saying, that, hey, a pool with 5 covered colonnades, I can't say that word, porticos, in John chapter 5. We already said that John chapter 5 was dated back to within the lifetime of the eyewitness. Now we're saying, okay, we've actually found the location where this was at, and it checks out to what John was saying. Some more examples. Caiaphas. In 1990, archaeologists discovered a limestone bone box in Jerusalem. So if you're not familiar with bone boxes, during this time, they would have a family bone box. So someone would die, they would put their bones, they would burn them, put their bones in a box, and they would keep the box. And then when somebody else dies, they put their bones in there, and it was a family bone box. Okay? So in 1990, archaeologists discovered a limestone bone box in Jerusalem, and inscribed on it was Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Well, who was Caiaphas? He was the high priest. He presided over Jesus' trial. That's talked about in Matthew 26 and John 18. All right? So it played a central role in handing Jesus over to Rome, and we've got documentation of it in Matthew and John. And then here we are in the 1990s, finding this bone box with that inscribed on it. Go ahead.
Why would we not think that there were like several Caiaphases?
Why would you think there are several Caiaphas?
Because why wouldn't there be? I mean, they were naming people. I mean, there was another Jesus on a cross next to Jesus. So it makes me feel like they probably weren't super creative. It's just, to me, it just seems kind of a leap, like in the 1990s, to be like, that must be the Caiaphas.
Well, so you have to take it into consideration, all right? It's in Jerusalem, all right? And what does it say on it? Joseph, son of Caiaphas.
Now, do we know from the Bible that Caiaphas had a son named Joseph?
I don't. That's a good question.
You see where I don't know. I mean, like,
we do.
It's not the strongest point.
We know.
To me.
The reason. Here's why I'm hesitant to say that. We do know that Caiaphas had a son named Joseph, right? Who was over Jesus' trial. I just don't remember if that's from external documents or in Scripture that talks about that off the top of my head. So
like, for instance, and just like right there, like Joseph was obviously a very common name. Mm-hmm. So just because Caiaphas isn't still a common name doesn't mean that back then it wasn't a very common name. Mm-hmm. So unless there's like other documentation to say that Caiaphas for sure Caiaphas had a son named Joseph, then I don't think it's the strongest piece of evidence that we have.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's not a lot of evidence that stands on its own. There's Does that make sense? So I mean, you think about like a murder trial. Okay, you may have the murder weapon, or you may have some piece of evidence that's placing that person in the same building as the person that got murdered, right? But that alone doesn't prove that they murdered that victim. However, if you have the fact that they were in the same building, and you have the fact that their DNA matches, and you have the fact that they owned a weapon that was identical to the one, or the same, let's say the same caliber of the one that shot the victim. You see what I'm saying? Like, none of those alone stand as evidence to convict that individual. But that's where you get a collective evidence. And you say, okay, yeah, Joseph, son of Caiaphas. All right, that doesn't prove that Jesus is the Messiah. That doesn't prove the validity of it. However, it does offer a piece of evidence to the collective case. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Okay. Good question, though.
Just commentary from online. It says, I feel that is why you see lineage so strong in the Bible. And I agree. I tend to skip over, not
We
skip,
I 100% skip it. I do.
like, oh, this, and this, and this.
I see it
but I'm
and I
with
go skip
them.
to it, yeah.
That's a good point. That it's listing it out for a reason.
That is a good
And this
point,
is a good this is a good example. I've not seen a real life example of, oh wow, that would be so important. But I agree here.
Other than us knowing that it's important for the prophecy.
Right. Agreed
why
there.
Else is it important? Right.
Where else
Oh my
can I
gosh,
use
what a great
this?
point.
Yeah. Great point, Scotty.
Yep. Great addition to it. All right, Luke's accuracy in Acts, titles, geography. So again, we're not looking at any piece of evidence here as the home run that's going to prove these documents as historically accurate. However, you have, at some point, just like with anything, once you reach a certain amount of evidence, it's like, okay, we can conclude now beyond a reasonable doubt that this is the conclusion, right? Same thing in a court case, murder trial. Once you have collected a certain amount of evidence, it's enough to sway the jury to say, okay, we can conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that this individual is the one that committed this crime. So we're picking examples of different pieces of evidence that lead us towards that conclusion. And again, what we want to do in this class, or what you should be doing, period, in apologetics, is not starting with a presupposition, not starting with this mindset that I need to go find the evidence that proves God exists, or I need to go find the evidence that proves Christianity is true. Rather, we're simply looking at the evidence and saying, what's the logical conclusion here based off of the evidence that we have and that we're following? And we're saying, okay, well, it's logical to conclude beyond a reasonable doubt. And I keep saying reasonable doubt for a reason. Because someone I know we're kind of getting off on a tangent here, and someone will tell you, prove to me that God exists. Well, how much proof do you need? Well, I need to know beyond a shadow of a doubt. Well, I can't prove to you beyond a shadow of a doubt that God exists, right? But I can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. You really can't prove anything beyond a shadow of a doubt in this world if you think about it. So that's an unrealistic expectation for that person to have to begin with. And that's why I keep saying it, because it's very important to distinguish between a shadow of a doubt and a reasonable doubt. So Luke uses specific political titles in Acts 18, verse 12. Gallio, he was the proconsul of Achaia. This is confirmed by an inscription at Delphi. Acts 19, verse 31, Ephesus. So uses, I cannot pronounce some of these words, so I apologize. You guys can read it and see it online. sharks, local officials, okay? But it's a historically, the point of it is it's a historically accurate term, meaning he would have to be there during that time to know that term, right? That was a local term. Like, what's some of the slang that kids use today, right? Like,
Courtney.
Okay, if I ask, so this is like all over. There's a.
do you want the microphone or you?
Keep us young,
No,
girl.
I don't know anything about the slang. I'm just thinking of a Facebook post that's like, what a Southerners call, and then it's like a
Oh.
picture of the thing you push around Walmart. If you're up
Oh, a
north,
buggy.
you don't
It's a
call
buggy.
you call it a shopping cart.
It's a buggy.
We call it a buggy. Like,
Yeah,
you know, depends on where you're at in the U.S. It depends on what you say.
that's right.
Like, we don't say you guys, we say y'all. But
And that's a good point, right? Like if there wasn't, was all that muted? Okay.
we just don't know how to-
That's a good point. Like if there wasn't social media, or say we didn't have vehicles, like we probably would never make it up north, living in the South, right?
So we wouldn't know what a shopping cart is.
So you wouldn't know what it is. And that's the same thing during this time period when you have, Luke using the verbiage of that area in that time. That just further proves, okay, Luke was in fact alive and living during this time in this area. And then in Acts 28, verse 7, you have Malta. It refers to the chief official of the island. It matches the local Roman title, protos. These titles varied from city to city, so getting them right isn't guesswork, right? You wouldn't be able to get these different terms and titles correct unless you were actually there,
We can't even say them.
Yeah, I know, right? So, like, yeah, they probably don't know what woke is, you know what I mean?
Oh God. Embarrassing details. about it.
Embarrassing details. Okay. So if these writers were inventing these stories, they would make themselves look good, not bad, right? If you were writing something down, if you were documenting something, you have to think about it. Like legacy was a big deal during this time. Being able to write down your testimony about yourself was a big deal during this time. So if you were just making something up, are you going to make up embarrassing details about yourself as a historical what you're claiming to be historically accurate? No. Now people make up stuff all the time that makes themselves look good, right? But nobody is going to make up something that's going to make them look bad. Here are just a few examples. Peter, previously Simon, denied Jesus 3 times. The disciples, first of all, if you're Peter, right, and Mark, you're with Mark and you're telling Mark what to write down, you're not going to be like, hey man, won't you put in there that I denied Jesus 3 times? You know what I'm saying? If we're making this up. No, you're not going to say that. The disciples flee at Jesus' arrest. They go into hiding, right? The women were the ones that were the first to the tomb, right? Who's going to make a man is not going to make that up. Like if somebody was to come in here shooting up the place, I'm not going to write down, yeah, I jumped behind the curtain and let my wife tackle the shooter, right? No, if I'm making this up, I'm going to say, yeah, I heroically jumped over the chairs and tackled this guy while the women shivered in fear. You know what I mean? Like, you're going to make yourself look better if you're making this up. They're not going to say that women were the first ones to the tomb. A woman's testimony at that time did not even carry the weight that it should have. They weren't allowed to give testimony, to speak, to be a part of that type of environment at that time. So you're not going to make that up either. The disciples repeatedly misunderstood Jesus' teachings. Are you going to put that in your testimony as well? Like, yeah, man, we just didn't understand what Jesus was saying. But he was the Messiah, though. No, you're going to think, man, yeah, we had it. We knew exactly what he was saying. That's why he picked us. You're going to puff your chest out. You're making this up. Peter gets rebuked by Jesus. Now, this is important Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Could you imagine if you're a fall, and you got to think like Peter was in the inner circle. So you had the 12 disciples, but then you had Peter, James, and John, who were in the inner circle. And so Peter's like the guy, all right? And you got Jesus telling Peter, "Get behind me." He's calling him Satan. You think he's going to put that in a document if he's making it up?
I wouldn't.
No, he's going to tell Mark, "Hey, leave that part out, would you?" And then Thomas doubts the risen Jesus. Yeah, I didn't think he was who he said he was. You know, like you're not going to put that in any type of historical document. And you're not going to lie about that. People don't invent stories that make themselves look bad. That's the moral of this slide right here. Does anybody have any questions about this? Does anybody disagree with this, what we're saying here? All right, here are some more non-Christian sources. So Tacitus was around from 56 AD to 120 AD. He was not a believer. He had no reason to contribute to Christianity, to contribute to the validity of Christianity. But what does Tacitus say? He says, Christus suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Now, does this prove that Jesus is the Messiah? No. But what does it prove? It proves that we have a Roman historian who wasn't promoting Christianity. In fact, he was somewhat against Christianity and talked down to the Christians. He's saying that there was someone named Christ, someone that they called Jesus, right? Could it be one of many people called Jesus? Yeah. But here's what he's saying. There's only one Jesus, there's only one Christ that suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. So we got a guy here who's not a Christian. He doesn't believe Christianity, and he lives during the shortly after the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus, and he is documenting this. I think that's pretty strong evidence towards this claim that there was a man named Jesus during that time, which also, keep in mind, this correlates with what the Gospels are saying. Josephus, AD 37 to 100, he's a Jewish historian, non-believer. You guys good?
Yeah, we just thought Bocephus when you said Josephus.
Oh.
I would have said Josephus.
He wrote that Jesus was a real person. He was a teacher. He was crucified under Pilate. His followers continued. Again, he's a non-believer, so he has no reason to promote this man named Jesus. He has no reason to try to continue that legacy. If anything, he probably wants that legacy to die out.
Well, and I mean, neither one of them are claiming or making the truth claim that he's the Messiah. They're just writing what they consider to be history, which was like that says wrote. Jesus was a real person. He was a teacher. He was crucified. He had followers.
Yep, you're right. Yep. If they were writing about his that he was the Messiah, they would be Christians, right? And so again, we're not trying to use this to prove that Jesus is the Messiah, but we are saying that there sure is a lot of extra biblical documentation that lines up with the historical claims that were made by the gospel writers, right? Remember, that's what we're doing here. We're establishing the gospels as historically accurate documents, okay? So far, they're standing the test of time. All right, so we have a Roman governor, Pliny. He lived from 61 AD to 113 AD. He was not a Christian. And in a letter asking how to deal with Christians, Pliny describes them as they meet on a fixed day before dawn. They sing to Christ as to a God. They commit to a moral behavior, meaning that they have this moral code, this objective moral standard that they live by. And this confirms early belief in Jesus' divinity. It's not evidence that Jesus is divine, but what it is evidence for is that there were, in fact, people that believed that Jesus was divine during that time. All right, and again, he's not a Christian, so he has no reason to promote Christ at all. He's just telling a historical account. Hey, there's these people that are meeting over here before dawn who are worshiping this guy called Christ, and they're morally good people. And this pushes back against the idea that Jesus' divinity was invented much later. So, sorry, we're just having some chaos in the kids' corner. So, let's point this out. Jesus' divinity was invented much later. That's the claim, right? Oh, well, Jesus may have been a historical figure, but people didn't start worshiping him. They made it up years and years later that he was God. Well, right here you have somebody around 61 AD to 113 AD who is saying otherwise. And he has no reason to make this claim other than he's simply reporting what he's seeing. He's a witness of people worshiping Christ as their Lord. So the New Testament fits perfectly in the real historical world, which is what we're trying to establish. We're trying to say that the New Testament is actually is the most historically accurate document that we have in existence today. If we're just talking about historical documents, their accuracy, the time frame that the events were written down, or the accounts were written down, compared to when the event actually took place, it's more accurate and it's closer to the actual event than 99.999% of historical documents that we have in existence in antiquity. So what about contradictions between the Gospels? Well, we said differences don't equal contradictions, right? Just because there's differences in these eyewitness accounts, that doesn't mean that they're contradictions. That doesn't mean that, oh, well, this can't be true. This witness is not telling the truth because there's a contradiction, a difference. Independent accounts are naturally going to vary. In fact, they support authenticity. The resurrection accounts differ in detail. However, they agree on the core events. So it doesn't matter if two eyewitnesses to the resurrection, one of them says, well, Jesus was, he took his last breath before he was stabbed with the spear. And the other one says Jesus took his last breath after he was stabbed with the spear. I'm definitely making this up right now. But my point is, it doesn't matter if those two differ. What matters is they both say that Jesus was crucified, right? They both say that he died. They both say that he was stabbed with a spear. So those core details are what we're focused on. It really doesn't matter in terms of validity, the minor differences. That just shows that they are in fact authentic by the eyewitnesses. All right, so we're pulling all this together. We're wrapping it up.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Amy.
I kind of forgot, but
That's fine.
so can you go back to the last
Yep.
slide? Okay, so in the historical events, does it tell us, like in the historical accounts, I meant, where they're not Christians, they're just giving us historical, do they tell us at all why Jesus was crucified? Do you know?
Well, yeah, we know that. I mean, we have Jewish documents that.
Well, I'm just saying, like, like the Roman documents or whatever, like, where they're talking about, yes, that happened under this Roman leader, like, did they say, like, why Christ was crucified at the hands of, or suffered like, worst penalty?
Some do. It was during that time, so you got to think when this person was alive, right?
Mm-hmm.
It would be like someone. It would be like someone writing about Elvis and making the assumption that he was a musician, right? Like, they would assume everyone in the world knows that Elvis was a musician, right? If they're writing about some particular event in his life, okay? So not every non-Christian source is going to say that well, Christ was crucified. This person named Jesus was crucified because he was claiming to be the Messiah.
Yeah, I guess what was the official reason on, like, Roman paper that he was, like, punished?
Because it said it was blasphemy. So you have to think, the Jews are the ones that crucified Jesus, right? They're the ones that turned Jesus over. They're the ones that wanted Jesus crucified because they thought he was committing blasphemy by saying that he was God. That's the whole reason he got crucified.
But was that a Roman law?
What?
Blasphemy, was that, like, against the law?
Yeah, blasphemy against the Messiah. It was fear of this movement starting. You have to think about it. Like,
basically, I mean, the Romans cared because they didn't want the Jews to have an uprising about it, and they were like, sure, do whatever you want with them. But I'm just, like, wondering, like, when their historians are writing about it, like, when they're like, and under the hands of Pontius Pilate, like, he was put to death because he was
claiming to be
a
the
thief,
Messiah.
but
that is all throughout Jewish. That's all throughout Jewish history, Jewish historical documents. Is that Jesus? That's why he was crucified, and so there really isn't a lot of confrontation or disagreement amongst historians on if Jesus was crucified. Historians, they collectively, I would say 98% of historians agree that there was a man named Jesus who was claiming to be the Messiah and was crucified. The big question is, did he rise from the dead? That is where the confrontation, the disagreement comes in.
yeah, I'm getting a little lost in, like, details that don't matter. I get it.
Yeah, there's so much overwhelming evidence that there was a man named Jesus who claimed he was the Messiah, who was crucified by the Romans, turned over by the Jews. That's an accepted historical fact. The question is, did he rise from the dead? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Good question, though. Good question. Uh-oh. It froze up. Oh, it's off. All right, so we're pulling it all together. We have early manuscripts. Remember, an important detail is that these manuscripts were originally written within the lifetime of the events that took place, meaning the people that are writing these manuscripts down, writing these events down, they actually were alive when the event took place. It's very important, that time frame between the event and when these events were recorded. If it was hundreds of years later, then you have a lot of time there for change, for twisted stories, for change. You start losing that authenticity. So that's very important, the early manuscripts. Then the fact that most of the manuscripts, most of the gospel writers were in fact eyewitnesses of the event that took place. These guys walked with Jesus. They knew Jesus on a personal level. I have no problem accepting that Mark was not an eyewitness of Jesus because he had Peter right there telling him the details in Mark. That's what he's saying is, hey, here's what I saw. Here's what happened. Peter had no reason to lie about it. We already went through why they wouldn't have a reason to lie about it and throw these embarrassing details in it. Peter's not going to say, hey, Mark, won't you add in there that Jesus called me Satan? Like, he's not going to say that unless it really happened. You know what I mean?
Even if he did lie, I don't know if I'm not aware of that. Even if he did lie, though, you've got 3 other books that have the same things, and they weren't all sitting down. You didn't have all these men just sitting there going, hey, let's write the same story 4 different ways, so that way 2,000 years from now people can argue about whether this is true or not.
Repeat that. Repeat that.
Yeah, so what Courtney is saying, she made a good point, is even if Peter did lie about that, you have other eyewitnesses that were there who could attest that that was in fact a lie. So there's really no way, if all of us in this room right now, or all of you watching online were eyewitnesses to something, and then I turn around and lie about it, you're gonna be like, hey, no, that didn't happen. So that's a really good point. The textual preservation, so the preserved text, like I said, we have early manuscripts that date around 100 to 200 AD. Now, that's not the original, but again, we already discussed that that's not a problem that we don't have that original copy. We have maybe a copy of the original, and we still have that today, and it matches what we have in our current Bible today, which is to indicate that has been textually consistent for 2,000 years. That's huge. I don't think I think we take that for granted sometimes. People don't understand what we're saying when we say we have documents that were written 100 years after the death of Jesus, and that document is literally saying the same thing word for word as what's in our Bible today. And then the embarrassing details. People aren't going to add embarrassing details into something that's not historically accurate. It just doesn't happen. So, to conclude, it is rational to treat the New Testament as serious historical evidence. And if you still question that the New Testament is a historically reliable document after going through all this, there is more evidence out there. You can, if you're watching online and you want more information about the historical aspect of the New Testament, I'd be happy to reach out and give you some of that information. We can only cover so much in an 8-week class at once a week. So with that, does anybody have any questions online or in person? I know I kept you guys for like almost 2 hours.
We didn't start till 6:50, so.
Yeah, that's true. We'll give it a couple minutes to see if any questions roll in online. Can you see how many people are viewing?
4.
Okay.
It's like about a 6-second delay, so give it a minute.
That's good. In case I trip and fall, you can end the live stream before.
Yeah.
Oh no, it'll already have it on there.
Tonight's lesson reminded me of the Ninth Gate. Y'all ever seen that?
Mm-mm.
No. It's Johnny Depp in it.
I think we're good then.
I've seen Pirates of the Caribbean.
I think
All right.
we're-
Well, since we don't have any questions, I know we covered a lot of information. If you guys think of any questions after today, in between now, speaking of which, well, first of all, let me just say this. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out throughout the week, and we can address them at the next class. However, the next class is not going to be next Friday. So we're not going to have class next Friday because all of my seminary exams are due next Friday.
Yeah.
I know.
Me
I'm
and Courtney had
slacking.
the same reaction. I'm like, okay.
So yeah, all of my exams are due next Friday, and I have 3 essays that are due next Friday. So
So basically what you're saying is you're a procrastinator and you're gonna get them done.
Yep.
Next Friday.
I'm definitely,
That is
I'm
what
definitely
Courtney,
getting them
the
done next
teacher,
Friday.
heard.
No, that's exactly what I did.
So if anybody is watching online, no class next Friday. We will pick up the following Friday with week 4.
Okay.
I appreciate everybody watching online. Hope you guys have a good weekend.